Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NMAC's second Community Spotlight webinar. My name again is Chip Lewis. I'm the Communications Director here at NMAC, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today, especially those of you on the East Coast who may be snowed in. We are very, very glad to have you with us here today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. Next slide, please. So everyone's audio has been muted by the presenter. If you have a question during this webinar, there are two ways you can ask those questions. The first is that at any time during the presentation, you can ask a question in the chat box. Next slide, please. So you can find the chat box there on the right-hand side of your screen. And at any time during the presentation, you can enter in your question in the chat box there and send it to either the presenter or to the entire audience. Next slide. Right there in the chat. So, and then hit send, and that will go to either the presenter or the entire audience, depending on what you selected. Okay, next slide. During the Q&A session after the presentation, we will circle back to the questions in the chat box, but if you'd have a question then, you can also indicate that you have a question by raising your hand on the right-hand side of your screen, and then we will unmute your line and you'll be able to ask your question then. But again, we will hold all questions either in the chat box or through raising your hand until the Q&A section after the presentation. Okay. Next, please. Oh, I got a little ahead of ourselves here. There we go. Okay. A little bit about NMAC. I'm sure you're all familiar with NMAC, but as we are now starting our fourth decade in service, we lead with race to urgently fight for health equity and racial justice and the HIV epidemic in America. And this webinar and the series it's a part of is part of our expanded efforts this year to really lead with race and focus on communities that don't always get the attention they need and they deserve in the fight against HIV. Right, next slide. Which brings us to our Community Spotlight series. This is the second edition of our Community Spotlight series. And it's a series of webinars to celebrate and spotlight communities that bear greater burdens in the HIV epidemic, but are often invisible or overlooked due to issues of race, gender, or gender identity. This is the second in this series we've done this year. We will do an additional 5 over the course of this year. And if you want to see the calendar of upcoming webinars, both in the Community Spotlight series and other webinars that NMAC will be presenting this year, visit our website at nmac.org/webinars. And next slide. Today's presenter really needs no introduction. She's very well known in the HIV community, and we are so pleased and honored to have her presenting today about women and HIV in the South. And it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Gina Brown of the Southern AIDS Coalition. Gina, once your line's unmuted, please take it away.
Thank you, Chip. Can you hear me okay? Well, I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Gina Brown with the Southern AIDS Coalition. Next slide. Next slide. SAC is a nonpartisan coalition of government, community, and business leaders working alongside thousands of individual members to end the HIV epidemic in the South. We do it in 4 different buckets: direct federal advocacy, capacity building and education, grassroots organizing, and the newest bucket to what we're doing is formative research. Next slide, please. We work really closely with the Southern HIV/AIDS Strategy Initiative, SASE, and a research team at the Duke University Center for Health Policy and Inequalities Research. A lot of the slides you'll see today come from the research that they're doing over at SASE. Next slide, please. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, thanks, Caffrey. The South now experiences the greatest burden of HIV, illness and deaths of any U.S. region, and lags far behind in providing quality HIV prevention and care to its citizens. That's according to the CDC. And those of us who work in the South, we know this to be true. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about two different things. We're going to talk about incidence and prevalence. And you know, incidence is the rate of new diagnoses. And prevalence is basically a cumulative case of those of us who've been living with HIV for a number of time, for a number of years or a period of time. Next slide, please. Is that? Okay. So as you can see from the graphs, the South is home to the most new HIV diagnoses. In the South, even though we are only 38% of the population, we account for 52% of the new HIV diagnoses in 2015. Next slide. This is just another map showing you how the United States look and how HIV is impacting different regions. And as you can see that most of the deep purple are in the deep South. So it's not just the South, it's the deep South also. We only have two, other than New York on the East Coast, we have two places on the West Coast that's in deep purple, and that's California and Nevada. And Nevada is basically new to this, to the most new HIV diagnoses. Next slide, please. Yes, the slides are jumping. I don't know what I did. I apologize, y'all. Come back a little. Right there, right there. So this was 2015, but basically it's still the same. If you look at the top 10 cities for new HIV diagnoses, you can see that they are all in the South. You know, Maryland doesn't like to think of themselves as the South, but they are. But these are all southern cities. And if you look at what's circled, Louisiana has 2 cities in the top 5. And this has been the case for a number of years. Next slide, please. We can go to the next one. Okay, go back. Keep going. Right there. Go back. No, one more. Yes. So this is just showing you again who's most impacted by HIV, and the way that it looks on this scale by race, it looks the same basic way by gender. So we know that African Americans or Black people bear the brunt of the epidemic. They make up a small percentage of the population, but carry a lot of the epidemic. Next slide. No, go. No, one more up. No, the other way. Go to one right there. Most women. Go back. Right, right there. So the South is also home to most women of color living with HIV. You know, 51% of us are living in the South who are living with HIV. And we know that the numbers for women of trans experience is even higher, even though we don't have a lot of data to show that. Next slide, please. Back one, I believe. All right, go up one, I'm sorry. Well, the South is also home to the most new AIDS diagnoses. We know that a lot of people receive their diagnosis late stage HIV. That's what they're calling it now. And there are a lot of reasons why, and we can talk about some of those reasons in a bit. But we also know that the South is home also to a lot of rural areas, and we don't often talk about access. And especially when it comes to women, we don't talk about access. Next slide. Next one. HIV and transgender people of trans experience. Transgender women in the United States are at a higher risk for HIV. We all know that. Half of transgender people diagnosed with HIV are Black. Many factors make HIV prevention among transgender people a challenge. And I would have to say the number one issue or factor would be the fact that we don't count transgender women separately. CDC has started extrapolating that data since 2009, but think of all of the women we know who received the diagnosis prior to 2009, who are not counted as transgender women. They were just counted as gay or bisexual men. Next slide. So this is a breakdown of diagnoses among people of trans experience from 2009 to 2014. Transgender men, it was about 51%. For transgender men, it was 58%. For transgender women, it was 51% for Black transgender. But the numbers really change when you look at transgender men Latinx and transgender women Latinx. Transgender men Latinx, the numbers are, I hope I'm not moving around too much, y'all, and making noise. I'm trying to get my paper. For transgender men Latinx, it was 15%. But then when you look at transgender women, it jumps up to 29%. Most of those diagnoses happen in the South. We know that. Next slide. So then we have to think about some of the drivers. If we're going to talk about HIV in women, and when I say women, this is inclusive of trans women also. So we think about poverty, because we're often told about risk factors and high risk. I have a little saying I like to say about high risk. To me, high risk sex is swinging from a chandelier or having sex in the middle of the interstate. It is not just having sex. Sex is sex. So we can't even say high risk, but we have to think about some of those drivers like poverty, violence, homelessness. Poverty, violence, and homelessness can all drive a person to having to have either survival sex or becoming a sex worker. Stigma. If you're a trans woman and you're living in a community where there's a lot of transphobia, that's stigma. And you may not know where to go to get condoms, or you might feel funny walking into a place to get condoms, or you may not know the biomedical parts of HIV. So that's why I have those up as drivers, and I didn't put up commercial sex work. I didn't put up promiscuity, because those are all relative. Those are how do you define them. I could have sex with a different man every day, and if it's not condomless sex, then am I really at risk? Or I could have sex with one man and it could be condomless. It could be condomless sex and I could still contract HIV. So it's all in how we talk about the things that impact women. We do something at SAC called the LEAD Academy. It stands for Leadership, Education, and Advocacy Development. And we work with women of color in the community, really to educate them and help them to go out and talk to other people other women who are living with HIV, whether they be cisgender or transgender, so that we can get rid of some of the stigma. We know that stigma keeps people from getting tested. Just to walk into a place and say, I'm going to go get tested, it all depends on who's working there. Y'all know and how you feel walking in and walking out. So that's why I have that up there. Next slide, please. So once again, we know that the South is home to the most people living with HIV. Half of HIV resides in the South. But we also know that a lot of women live in the South. And when I talked earlier about access and the lack of access, just because a clinic is in a neighborhood does not mean I have access to that clinic. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if a clinic is in my neighborhood, and even if it's a sliding scale fee, if it's not a zero fee, I may not be able to go there. Or if I'm in a rural area and everybody knows everybody, I'm not going there. So it just continues the cycle that we've been seeing for a number of years. That's why it's so important that we talk about it and we talk about all of the marginalized communities that that are impacted by HIV and talk about them in a real way. Next slide. I'm gonna get off my soapbox, y'all. So the South is also home to most new AIDS diagnoses or late-stage HIV diagnoses, however you want to say it. And once again, we talk about the lack of access, and the stigma. I live in a state, Louisiana, where we still criminalize HIV. So even with the biomedical, with us knowing that U equals U, with us knowing everything we know, I live in a state that still says I can go to jail if somebody says I didn't tell them. And the burden is on me. Next slide. We already said this, most people living with HIV reside in the South. Next slide. We're also home to the most undiagnosed HIV. So there are more people walking around who may be living with HIV and don't know it in the South. Once again, it's because of a lot of different factors. We can think about, or we can talk about some of them right now. Number one being criminalization, stigma. Some people just don't even know that they should get tested because we still put it with behavior. So if I'm a woman and I'm in what I think is a monogamous relationship, and you tell me I need to get tested, I'm going to look at you like you're crazy, because I don't need to get tested because I'm not doing anything that you said make me susceptible to HIV. So why should I get tested? So we have to change the way we talk about things also if we want to get people tested. Next slide. The South has the highest lifetime risk for HIV. And it's not because we're having more sex in the South or what tends to happen, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because I'm looking at who's on here, and I know most of y'all, is we tend to have sex with people in our community. So if I'm having sex with someone in my community and that person has an STI or HIV, my chance of contracting it is a little higher than if I was having sex with someone who wasn't a part of my community and I did some other things. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of times I think because we don't talk about HIV in a real way, people don't realize that for a woman, your risk factor is the fact that you're a woman. We're the receptive partner, and that's basically that's it. Next slide. The South also has fewest people on PrEP. As I was looking for information on women, cisgender and transgender women on PrEP, that information is really, really scarce. And I know a few years ago I was involved in focus groups to gauge how women in the South felt about I'm sorry, I lost my train. Felt about PrEP. And a lot of women didn't even know about PrEP. And then I started having deeper conversations with providers, and they were saying things like, well, in order to qualify for PrEP, a woman has to answer yes to this, 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 and this. And I'm like, why can't it just be that she feel like she needs to be on PrEP? Why does it have to be that she has to answer if she's promiscuous? She has to answer if she's, having sex with a man who may be having sex with a man. It doesn't make sense, especially if we're really going to work to end this epidemic. If someone presents and they want PrEP, we should make sure that they can get PrEP. Next slide. Okay, next. So this is the U.S. population, and as you can see, go to the next one, please. and this PrEP utilization. So white Americans make up 64% of the population, but there's 74% of people who utilize PrEP. Next slide. But look at the estimated new acquisitions of HIV or acquisitions of HIV in 2014. It was with Black Americans. So we know that for Black men, they're not utilizing PrEP at high numbers, and for Black women, it's even much, 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 much lower. But for women across the board, even for trans women, it's really low. Next slide. And that's why I say not enough. We don't have enough women on PrEP. We don't have enough women that we can have a conversation with about PrEP and make it about a medical condition and not judgmental. Not about, girl, is your man sleeping with a man? It should never be part of the conversation. It should always be about being able to, number one, protect yourself, and number two, if we're working to end the epidemic, you know, we have to give people the tools to do it, and making PrEP more readily available to women, having campaigns that really speak to women, thinking about it in the way that, yes, there's a lot of stigma, but sometimes when people see things more and more, it chips away at that stigma. I know for me, I can only speak from personal experience. When I was hiding my diagnosis, it felt like I had a tree or a house on my back. And once I started telling people my diagnosis, it was easier to walk in this thing. I want to make it to where women are seeing billboards about PrEP, and they're seeing themselves in that billboard. I want to make it where women are going to their doctors and they're talking about getting on PrEP, whether they're cisgender women or transgender women, and they're not being made to feel like they're lowered and low or the worst thing walking because they feel like they want to protect themselves. Yeah, I think I went enough with that one. Next slide. So as you saw on the other chart when we listed them, we're going to talk about 3 of the states in the South that has really, really horrible numbers. And although I have not pulled out, and it doesn't say women specifically, just know that everything that's bad in these communities, for one, is across the board. So in South Carolina, they're number 9 in the rate of new HIV diagnoses. They're number 6 in the rate of new AIDS diagnoses. They're number 8 in the rate of diagnosed people living with HIV. They're number 9 in percentage of undiagnosed HIV, and they're number 9 in rates of HIV-related deaths. That's a southern state. Next slide. My little state. We're number 1 in the rate of new HIV diagnoses. We're number 1 in the rate of new AIDS diagnoses. I can tell y'all something about Louisiana. We're always number 1 for the bad stuff, and we're number 50 for the good stuff. Anyway, we're number 5 in the rate of diagnosed people living with HIV, number 1 in percentage of undiagnosed HIV, number 3 in rates of HIV-related deaths. Yeah. Next slide. Mississippi is number 5 in the rate of new HIV diagnoses, number 5 in the rate of new AIDS diagnoses, number 10 in the rate of diagnosed people living with HIV, number 10 in percentage of undiagnosed HIV, and number 7 in rates of HIV-related deaths. Before I say thank you, I will say, and I know I may have like zipped through this, and I'm sorry if I did, because we can talk for a long time, y'all. But people say that the rates for women have gone down, but they forget the rest of that sentence. And yes, we've seen a 20% decrease in the rates for women, right? But not all of us have been tested. Only about 50% of Black women have been tested. And we have to do better with that. You know, like I said, I think we can end this epidemic, and I think that we can target the people who are marginalized and people who we don't often talk about. And I think that we have to make sure that trans women, that everything we do, we bring trans women into the conversation. Because if we don't, we're never going to end this thing, you know. So we have to be inclusive. We have to make sure that we're talking about women, we're talking about trans women, we're talking about gay and bisexual men. We're not leaving anybody out of the conversation. So I want to thank NMAC. I want to thank Chip, Daniel, Sable, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. I know I probably was speaking 100 miles an hour, and I apologize for that. But we're going to open it to some question and answers, and then we can just have a dialogue. Next slide. And this is who I am.
All right, Gina, thank you so much. We really do greatly appreciate it. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So now we're into Q&A. Again, as we mentioned before, if you have a question, please, you can type it into the chat box and we can read it off here, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute your line for you to ask your question. One bit of housekeeping before we get into questions and answers. Once we finish Q&A, we will give you 2 polls for you to, we hope you'll take part in, part of our evaluation process, so you can give us feedback on ways we can improve future webinars. And there will also be an evaluation form once the entire webinar is completed. We also ask you to fill that out as well to give us your feedback. So let's open it to questions. And again, feel free to type it into the chat box or to raise your hand, and we will unmute your line for you to ask your questions. Gina, you get a lot of praise in the chat box. So I think you did a really outstanding job. So thank you again. Gina, let me throw out a question here, maybe just get things started. What do you think are probably the best approaches we could take right now to really reach women in the South with the prevention and treatment message?
I think one thing we can do is we can address those other issues. So if we can bring women together and talk about job readiness training, if we can bring women together to talk about domestic violence and do it because, you know, there's a lot of stigma with that also. So doing it in a really non-stigmatizing way. Then we can introduce the concept of getting an HIV test, of doing some things you have to, you know, in order to not contract HIV. I know a lot of people think the South that we're backwards and we're slow. We're not. We're very much aware. But I can only speak for New Orleans. We're also very clannish, meaning that the neighborhoods you grew up in, you tend to live in your whole life. So what we have to do is we have to make sure we know who the gatekeepers are in those neighborhoods, and we're talking to them, because we're going to have to really have the community helping us to get to these women.
Great. Gina, we have a couple of questions coming up in the chat box. So let's go back to the top of here. We are seeing funding cuts to comprehensive safer sex education and a movement towards abstinence-only education. How can we reach the younger population and women in the South?
Whew. Yes, yes. What I did, and this is, but this, I mean, I know that because I am living with HIV, I look at things a little differently. So what I did was I educated my daughter in a way that she could go out and educate her friends. Because young people, they don't want me standing there telling them about sex. They don't want me to talk about sex. So I have to make sure that my daughter is able to talk to her friends about it in a real way. And I talk to their parents about it. But one thing we have to do is we have to get people to understand that just because young people learn about sex does not mean they're going to have sex. It's when we don't know anything about sex that we go and have sex. And then we do it all wrong and we wind up with a baby, a STI or something else, you know, and it's all of these things that could have been prevented. And we don't do that. And we also have to talk to our legislators and make sure because think about it, I know in Louisiana, most of my legislators are Republican. So they're pro-life or pro-baby in the womb, whatever you want to call it. So you have to tie to that sometimes, even though we don't like playing one side against the other. Sometimes you have to have that conversation, you know, with a legislator to say, you know, you don't want anyone to have an abortion, but this is how you can prevent that, by educating young people, by making sure that young people know that when they do decide to become sexually active or whatever, there are places they can go and talk to people, you know.
All right. Next question. What can we do as advocates in the South to make sure women get tested more?
We can, this don't sound really, really crazy, but I've been thinking of this lately because one of the agencies I work with, they do testing, and having a testing party. So having you know, like young people, they do it at colleges where they have a night where everybody come and whoever wants to get tested, they get tested, and there's no judgment, no anything. And we can do that. But we also have to start going where women are. We're not going to test women in the bars. No, that's not going to happen. But you know what? Where women go all the time, women go to the wig clinic and they go to the hairdresser. So even if you're not testing them there, if you're going in there and you're doing education with people, it will make you kind of make up your mind a little more to get tested.
Okay. Next question. Do you know of any states or programs that have implemented innovative strategies to address women specifically?
Well, that's what we're doing at SAC. Our innovative strategy is to get a group of women who have leadership potential or who are already leaders. And we're really educating them in 3 different trainings. You know, Kafra and I do it, and Marvin do the Lead Academy. So, but there are other places and other entities that are doing amazing work with women. The Well Project, just through their blogging, you know, just through the blogs, women are able to connect. PWN are able to connect women. So it may not be innovative as far as in a community-based organization, but it's innovative in that it is women in the community can put their hands on
it. All right. Next question. What is your experience in HIV navigation services offering to Black women in the South, particularly women contemplating PrEP?
I do not have any personal experience in working with women in PrEP other than to do just education in the community. Whenever I see someone or everybody in New Orleans basically know I'm living with HIV. So if they see me, they may ask me a question. We have billboards up and they'll say, you know, I saw a billboard and that there's a pill that gets rid of HIV. And then I have to tell them, you know, that it doesn't get rid of HIV. It prevents you from contracting HIV. So then we go through this whole thing. And then I tell them about PrEP. I tell them about the PrEP clinic that we have in New Orleans, and try to get them in touch with one of the women who are peer advocates in our city so that that person can hold their hand and walk into that clinic with them.
Okay. Next question. What steps can women advocates take to get the word out about PrEP?
We can talk about it. We can talk about it to everyone. We can tell everybody we know about PrEP. But we have to learn about it too, because, you know, PrEP is not just a pill, it's a program. So tell people, you know, they're going to have blood work done every so often. You know, they're going to, certain things you just still have to do. So having those conversations. And what I like to do is I like to put stuff, and I know a few people on the call, we like to put stuff on Facebook So to educate through social media is a great way. If there are any webinars, if there are any Twitter chats happening around Women in PrEP, join those so that as you're tweeting out stuff, your followers are seeing it. So you're doing more education.
Great. Any further questions from anyone? These are all great. We appreciate asking these. If not, let's go to the next slide real quickly. Let's do the polls real quickly before everybody goes. Let's launch the first poll. So we'll give you a few seconds here to fill out this poll. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we'll finish that poll. Let's do next one. Email. That's good to know. And I see we had one more question. We'll come back to that after this poll. Give everyone a few more seconds on this poll. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right. Gina, we had one more question that just came up. It said social media is a bit dicey in the context of, and I'm sorry, PHI. I'm assuming that's personal health information. What are your thoughts on that?
You don't have to give out any personal health information when you're educating people on different things. What I do is I just put out questions. I might say like to the people on Facebook, who can tell me what PrEP is for? And then I have them come in, and some people, are like, oh, that's what you do before you cook, you prep your food. And then, you have and it's funny at times, but you have a conversation. So it doesn't have to be anyone coming to or you putting out, I'm living with HIV. If you're living with HIV, tell me, no, you don't have to do that. But you can say, this is PrEP, this is what it is. Talk to your doctor. And more than anything, if you're an advocate and you're working with people in the community, kind of have an idea of where they can go for those services. So instead of just saying, talk to your doctor, you can say if you don't have a doctor, or if you're thinking about starting PrEP, this is a clinic that you can call this number and they'll give you all the answers. Without even identifying who it is that's asking the question or who you're targeting with that number. Because whoever wants it can write it down at that point.
Great, okay. Let's do the final poll real quickly. And we give everyone a little bit of time to fill this one out. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you to everyone who took part in those. Before we go, just a reminder, please fill out the evaluation form once the webinar ends. It's a big help to us in making sure that we can make these presentations as good as we can make them. Mark your calendars. Our next 2 webinars coming up, April 11th, we will have one on the scholarship process to attend the U.S. Conference on AIDS in September. If you're interested in applying for a scholarship, that's a great webinar for you. And on April 24th, we'll have the next in our Community Spotlight series with a focus on youth. And again, you can find information about all of our upcoming webinars at nmac.org/webinars. One last call for questions. Anybody has any questions? Seeing none, thank you, Gina, so much for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. Fantastic job as always. And thank you to everyone else who joined us today. We will see you again on a future webinar. Thank you all so much and have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you.